Hello everyone, today we talk about Bronze Age warfare, Arabian Desert, nomadic warriors, cameled troops. I already actually made a very similar video for properly the Arabian Desert nomad of the Achaemenid army, which is also close with the iconographic evidence we're using here and more, in fact, to more or less the same period, in part because the Arab tribes did not really change that much in their warfare for a long time. In part, however, we must create a joint continuity between periods that are actually different to spice up say this is a military historical unit video, but to spice it up a little bit, just like for other videos, we add some greater historical background to the specific tribes in this case that would produce such type of warrior, especially through the Assyrian history. So of the campaigns waged against these peoples. I made a video about the Amorite warrior as well that is similar to that, but it's also going a bit more back in time. There is a point here that the camel was domesticated around the end of the second millennium BC, right? So there was a time in which these nomadic peoples were nomadic, but not much because of their tactical mobility. They would actually be nomadic because they would move on foot regularly across the literal desert and participate into like the various Mesopotamian, Egyptian, say Fertile Crescent broadly meant warfare. In pretty interesting ways. These were truly the savages, the barbarians of the situation, but to a point of quasi-anonymity in terms, in fact, of the basicness, let's say, of their warfare. That, however, was also annoying. Many of these war bands ravaged some of the crops, the cultivations of many like more sedentary civilizations across the millennia. Here we will just speak mostly about 7th century BC warfare, like something between, let's say, the end of the second millennium and that period when we get specific information about them. We will naturally see some of these warriors in action in some battles video, have some incoming, not specifically actually the Battle of Rafah, 721 BC between the Assyrians and the Egyptians. It's actually closer to, in fact, this Arab context than actually the information of the sources can tell us, because we know a few about the battle, but it's still worth, in fact, even there looking at a bit like the background, the polities involved, and so giving that amount of context that in of itself informs the video in itself. I also am preparing a video about medieval Arabian warfare between the 11th and the 14th century, but this is sort of more disconnected, a bit of Schwerpunkt internal promotion, but I know that you're loyal and you will stick around to watch it anyway. So let's speak a bit about this Arabian Desert moments. First of all, the peoples here involved. We have groups like the Midianites, the Amalekites, the Alamu, the Aribi, right? Especially these are in the earlier, say, the Bronze Age ones. The ones we don't. So it's actually a bit beyond this period as well. We're already in the Iron Age, but you know you can approximate it because there are especially later groups. In fact, in the sort of nearer Iron Age, such as the Azamed, the Nabateans, the Kidraya, the Atarsamian, that actually did fight or were present at the time. Actually, about the chronology, for example, of Nabatea, when was it disestablished, like as a realm? This happened later, but these were at the end of the day the same groups that fought with the Assyrians back in the day, and against which, in fact, the Assyrian military launched also offensives deep into Arabian territory, or at least like those locations that allowed to control the part like the same desert route, right? The caravan ones that, in any case, were directed towards sort of this more controllable, like, say, portual, often agricultural centers. And so there is all like an internal Arabian chronology that at some point, I don't know when or how, we'll look at a bit more in depth. Naturally, we know very few, like some of the information, like how distinguishing these groups is, even just in a political sense, sometimes is not easy at all. And military-wise, they actually fought all pretty much in the same ways. At least we don't have any major, of course, there were some environmental, political, social differences that would make these armies vary to a degree, but just the essentials were the same, and in any case, we don't know much about this variation. Like their primitivity, their poverty, their sort of hopeless, like in fact, nomadic lifestyle that was just like loot, raid or die, basically, tells it all, and that's why they were also so present, even as not much of a might to be reckoned with, but also historically, right? Think about the Islamic invasion. This started from the peripheral peoples that had always been in that situation compared to other. In fact, during the Bronze Age, this is, as we were saying before, exactly what happens. Like when there is a major collapse of a kingdom or an empire, you have these peoples at the outskirts. Think about during the Roman Empire as well, like in another context, the fall of the Carolingian Empire, etc. You always have these surprise, the secondary peoples launching raids, and people say this were the cause of the fall. If anything, they were more like the consequence of it, of the destabilization, of the incapacity, even of this Mesopotamian city-states to effectively control this territory, to stop the incursions, the infiltration of these groups. It could be that small, but not less insidious, right? And that would also lend their military service to the highest bidder for that matter. So you would find these guys around. As you know, there are some of the Semitic groups that even we've seen it in the videos about the Neo-Hittite warfare that settled further north in Syria among the same Hittites in that case. And so there's pretty mixed legacy. Besides, the Bible talks as a whole extensively about them, of course individually, as we will see now, like just maybe in a punctiform way, because again they were just Arabian tribes of this pretty long time ago, and so they wouldn't necessarily even appear that often because their life was sometimes very short politically because of its instability. But again, we don't want to sort of ignore the major groups, right? And I would give this much of a background. For the most important, the Midianites, the Amalekites, before I said Midianites, Amalekites, depends on how you want to pronounce that, and the Alamu. I couldn't find much about the Aribi and these other peoples, the Zamne, also the Nabateans, at least at this point, because we will talk about the Nabatean warfare later, Riom, the Kidraya, the Atarsama, etc. They all have a history, but of course, like it's so poorly recorded that we don't know too much. Let's talk about the Midianites, right? The military history associated with Midian is definitely marked by notable wars between them and the Israelites, especially. According to biblical accounts, particularly the book of Numbers, the Israelites waged war against the Midianites in response to a series of events involving seduction and idolatry, culminating in this decisive showdown. And the conflict led to the destruction of Midianite cities, right? The death of their combatants, with the biblical text specifying that all non-virgin females were also killed, which is quite interesting. This is purely traditional concept, of course. You would take just the virgins after having destroyed their fathers, not their husbands immediately, nor their children. This military engagement was framed within a broader narrative where the Israelites had previously been oppressed by Midian forces for 7 years, but ultimately and triumphantly turned the tide under the leadership of Gideon, who defeated Midian's forces. Additionally, the Midianites are referenced in the context of various religious and cultural practices, indicating, of course, their also social political significance. It wasn't just like mere savages from the wilderness, right? There was some, as we've seen, level of, say, we talked cities here is a big word, but of course the centers did exist along the current routes. They allowed to accumulate enough surplus and wage war, against more stable realities like the Jewish one. It was, however, not yet fully sort of stabilized, and as we've seen also in other videos about Israelite warfare at this point. However, it is still these biblically recorded military encounters that predominantly colored their historical portrayal, particularly their eventual decline following these reversals suffered at the hands of the Israelites. Then, passing to the Amalekites, right? There was, even in this case, like a significant military engagement between them and the Israelites. The Amalekites were a nation recognized as the enemy of Israel, and according to the Hebrew Bible, the Amalekites, descendant of Amalek, initiated conflicts during pivotal moments of the Israelites' journey, notably in the Exodus. They ambushed the Israelites at Rephidim, leading to a battle where Joshua commanded the Israelite forces. The outcome hinged on Moses' raised hands, symbolizing divine support. This encounter set the stage for later biblical mandates dictating the historical animosity towards Amalek, instructing the Israelites to eradicate their memory once they possessed the promised land. In the Bible, God's challenge against Amalek was pronounced through the prophet Samuel, who commanded King Saul to destroy them entirely, a mission he ultimately failed, leading to divine disfavor, actually. The narrative includes several military confrontations. Amalek's joint attacks with the Moabites and the Ammonites. So these were actually also more, say, far-ranging, areas geographically. Their raids alongside the Midianites as well that devastated Israelite resources, as we were pointing out before, the general modus operandi of these nomads. And David's retaliatory strikes against the Amalekites, which included the recovery of captives and spoils that had been taken from the Israelites. Right, this is very important. Despite the historical ambiguity surrounding Amalek's existence, their depiction as perennial enemies in the biblical context underscores their role as a recurring threat to Israel's stability and security. And of course, the Bible situates these military actions within a larger framework of divine commandments and national destiny. Finally, we have the Alamu, a group of Semitic semi-nomads playing a significant role in military dynamics in the ancient Near East, initially mentioned around 1800 BC in inscriptions from Rim Anum, king of Uruk. Their presence is noted in various contexts, indicating their engagement in raids and military activities. They are associated with the Amorites that I was mentioning before, so if you're interested in them, you realize that they were similar peoples in general. We'll see now their tactical, the strictly technical side of their combat capacities and general warfare, but they fit all into this broader Arabian nomadic, semi-nomadic context, right? And the Alamu are even more specifically associated with one tribe that is the Arameans, right? Who often collaborated with the Suteans in military endeavors. Their raids extended as far as the Persian Gulf, disrupting trade routes in Dilmun and serving as a source of conflict for established kingdoms. This aspect is quite fascinating because, of course, from within the Arabian Desert, these peoples could move in different rates, especially with leagues, joining forces from literally one side or the other of the peninsula. Where do we strike? Like there is the Mesopotamia in the north, but there are this, as we've seen, coastal centers all along the Arabian coastland as well. So these are the more sort of interland, say, primitive tribal populations that strike sort of the more developed, urbanized agricultural centers that were rising in Arabia. Now, Assyrian rulers, as we will see better in a while, recorded multiple confrontations with the Alamu, highlighting their resistance and the threat they posed. Kings such as Adad-nirari II and Shalmaneser I documented victories against them, noting that these nomadic forces, sometimes backed by the Mitannians, I made a video about the Mitannian war chariot, engaged in uprisings that challenged Assyrian authority. Right? It was not strange to see, in fact, more advanced forces, even still of sort of that barbarian kind for the major Fertile Crescent civilizations, using these auxiliaries, coordinating the raids with them, and so also with the technicalities connected to their warfare scene. For example, I don't know, chariots. Surely Arabs had chariots. It's not something that you see too often because, again, they were so backwards that in many ways, like, they didn't have this enormous surplus for affording like a consistently organized type of chariot warfare. But of course their elites had, most of them would actually support the chariots on foot, and as you'll see now also on this with this camel troops, in ways that also unfortunately we can't simply reconstruct too easily. At least as you'll see now, the iconographic evidence we can see actually from Assyrian art is just more specifically focusing on just the Arabs separated from the others, because that's essentially where, aside from the individual expeditions into Arabia that this art is also representing, there is a general sense of course, like when you engage these people, it's these people we're talking about. Of course, in the Bronze Age, there wasn't even this radical difference at some point between some people or another. Like chariot warfare, of course, was the hallmark of military development, but in many ways, like besides chariot warfare, the remainder, especially before properly the spread of cavalry proper and camelry proper, like there were even less options. Now, the Alamu raids were not limited to attacks on resources, right? The uprisings that mostly took part of were aimed at challenging Assyrian authority, and so their main goal was obstructing communication between kingdoms. Like, they didn't have this massive field armies that could simply engage in open field, especially against again chariot forces of the major powers out there, but they could make these states bleed, especially in moment, as we've seen, of pre-existing instability, really devastating all the connections between these countries, their agricultural infrastructure, and more. The Babylonian king Kadashman Enlil II noted this plague, complaining about assaults on messengers, for example. So again, you can even compare some of these groups to simple brigands, right? And again, the Arab was a synonym of this at this point in history. In the civilized people sources, probably that's the style of Bedouin guerrilla rather than like something more threatening. But of course, when greater forces were joined from the interland, especially when somebody was coming to threaten some Arabian territory, things could get relatively more complicated. We'll see now, because of course our information is limited, and it mostly does refer you have to understand it in the general poverty of the time. Like the general incapacity really put together like one of those field armies, and so more stereotypically, even in larger engagements, having these guys melting away. This is something that, or at least keeping a distance, right? Not engaging, trying to skirmish, trying to lure the enemy, to wear him out, bog him down, And this is something that we've seen often in many contexts. Say, I don't know, Rome against the Parthians or other, of course, confrontations where there is an evident divide in terms of civilizational development, and therefore, yes, like you venture in this frontier that is wild and so also less fruitful, but these guys are always there harassing you, so every once in a while you have to make a showdown, massacring a bit of them. We've seen how the Israelites thought about them. And this, by the way, hit and run things like having to come back, recapturing hostages, etc. It sounds dreadfully as if nothing had truly changed from those times to their own in terms of the Israelite-Arab conflict, even though it's really something, say, it's more like it's not much like a fight against the Arab world, but or the Islamic one, just in a narrower sense. It is about very specific policies that are doing very specific things against Israel, and that otherwise would have much more different means to operate, and you can't but understand, of course. Now, the resilience of the Alamu continued into the Neo-Assyrian period, made some videos about Neo-Assyrian warfare, where kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II reported military actions against the Alamu. Notably, Sargon II described a brutal tactic of using water to defeat the Alamu, namely creating a canal to drown the Arab forces, which also, the sense was, of course, by cornering them. And speaking of actually forces could be bottled up, could concentrate at some point to be properly struck in that sense, or trapped. That's something we observed also for Sumerian warfare as early as the battle, in fact, of Ningirsus field, and in other contexts where all these various canals in the Fertile Crescent, etc., were quite dangerous places to move around, because you could literally be boxed somewhere where you wouldn't have any chance but to throw yourself into the water. And in any case, if you had wanted to maintain cohesion under enemy onslaught, that would have been a disaster. We've seen it's really often, also the Israelites attracted enemy forces, some, more stronger ones and more, in fact, more advanced on some river beds, to put them in difficulty, especially as far as chariots' maneuverability was concerned. So here it's slightly different, because you understand, as we said before, that peoples like the Alamus were not that heavy, but of course they had their own needs, and again were more concentrated. In this case, you could have found also that same sort of strategical, logistical issues to exploit, to defeat them. The Alamu's reputation as formidable warriors was reinforced by their service as mercenaries for other powers, such as the Hittites and the Midianites, demonstrating their military capability and tactical importance in the region. Again, very simple people, but very, in the sense, desperately aggressive, and so habituated to massacre to survive. That makes often, right, in history, the best type of mercenary, because it costs relatively few, but it has sort of this violent experience in his curriculum, and so they would go around, right, and be employed by different foes, which of course make us think how complex these people's politics really was within the same Arabia, because it would have been different clans trying to maintain more stability, others going out, also, say, triggering the neighbors, obliging other groups to take position, and again to search for longer range connections. This is quite interesting, because again, we don't see too much about this sort of international relations and what probably were the single authorities under which this happened this early in time, but they existed, right? Overall, as we've seen, the Alamu's activities significantly influenced the military landscape of the ancient Near East, marking them as a noteworthy adversaries in the conflicts of their time. Looking at the Arab desert nomad as a warrior, right? We've seen that things do not really change much over time. The camel, as we were saying before, first appears as a mount for warriors at the end of the second millennium BC, the beginning of the first. This is interesting because it is exactly like the same time in which cavalry develops proper. Of course, as soon as the horse was successfully employed for military purpose, that is for the development of territory, some kind of horseman employed in military context that always existed, but properly the arm of cavalry, something that develops only from this type onwards, right? And so it's interesting that the camel was domesticated around the same time, because actually the horse was domesticated before, and as soon as it was domesticated, it was also brought into the old civilization of the Near East by such sort of camel nomads that we have listed, the Midianites, the Amalekites, the Alamu, the Arabi, etc. And like bent for this military purpose as well. After all, warlike people would have not done it otherwise, because also the camel had some cost, right? It's not simply like a camel living out there on his own in the desert at all. And in order to employ these mount effectively, like of course there have to be enough numbers. It has to be an arm in itself. Naturally, we're looking at skirmishing, guerrilla, sort of hit and run tactics mostly, but it's not like these forces weren't used en masse. At some point, the camel first appears as a mount for warriors at this point, as we were saying, before the 7th century. We think that when we start having an adequate iconographic documentation, it would have been more likely usual to find a single rider, right? And I say this because the Assyrian representations of Arabs riding to a camel may well be an indication of the success of Assyrians' campaigns of attrition, where they would actually kill or starve this mounts, and so also would oblige for mobility, like the Arabs to say crowd this animal's runs to get out of the way quickly. Remember, again, this is why I said that the camel was a precious asset, because it can't be struck, just like horses, of course, were extremely costly in a general perspective, but even more charitably. Like, of course, the camel in itself was vulnerable, right? Could be used for a specific purpose, but against such powerful military like the Assyrian one, it's obvious that the Arabs would have had, first of all, to protect their camel, herds and breeding, which would have become immediately a target of the enemy. In fact, there was a very precise strategical pattern here. Yes, as we've seen, Arabia is not really the best place which, like, such powerful entities like the Assyrian Empire would like to expand in, but they were essentially also the source from which these harassers came from. And the Arabian hinterland is, of course, just pretty basic. Like, there are vast areas that are uninhabited in the first place. And when you have to maintain such cameled forces in a consistent way, you need, first of all, oases, right, where the Arabs would build wells. And we know that the Assyrians would actually poison the latter forcing the nomads at that point to actually slaughter their camels that would be actually used even to satisfy the Arab thirst. In fact, the Arabs would drink camel blood at that point. Surely there was something, say, primitively necessary in certain materially dear circumstances. But at the same time, it was also probably something cultic associated with the camel and its military use. Just think of how important this was for the horse in general and other animals in these people's religions. We'll see it better at some point. And therefore rendering the general sources, let's say at least stations where camels could properly be could themselves survive unsafe, and bringing to the death of many of these animals. So we think that the earlier Arabs, that of course would have used a bit like the same strategies while fighting against each other, would have, however, had some sort of more practical respect for, especially the Aussies, that they would have used themselves. It's like, I don't know, we've seen it in Gaelic warfare, like this hidden paths and pre-arranged fireplaces used by every warband out there, just like a common good, even among enemies. Of course, they would also try to damage each other at some point, but nothing of the destructive scale of the Assyrian army that was just like there, the big guns coming to probably with a massively destructive force, eliminating through some scouts. Some forces, of course, were detached into the desert. That was not really a great place to go with larger forces anyhow, and that's why probably also other Arabs carry out this task. Some auxiliaries, in this sense, mercenaries, we've seen them, would be deputed with, in fact, the task of destructing these wells, which were among some of the more advanced infrastructure that the Arabs have. The same goes for major Arab centers in the first place, but these peoples were fundamentally nomads or semi-nomadic, and that was also a problem. They could go deeper, as we've seen, crossing the same Arabian Peninsula longitudinally in ways that, of course, were not that immediately easy, because the Arabs had all, as we've seen, different polities and so different territorial boundaries between each other, and you couldn't quite do whatever you wanted. But under a general pressure put by major empires like the Assyrian one, well, there would have been also some degree of cooperation and possibility actually of further, let's say, increase in the level of generalized cohesion, like organization. So, as we've seen, providing even with, some sort of field forces, which, however, was incredibly rare. Arab tribes were headed either by kings or, surprisingly, queens. We will see perhaps this better in some other unit type, like because some of these leaders and their armament, we've seen it for the Amorites as well, were as primitive but also interesting, because it shows you what would make a king in such an underdeveloped context. Here we're going towards sort of more advanced times, but especially aside from Yemen, that was sort of the most developed part of Arabia, like this other places, as you know, also for very long in time would remain practically very primitive. Arab military organization would be based on clans. An army would simply comprise a master of all tribesmen, acknowledging the authority of a particular leader. Multiple clans make tribes. Multiple tribes make, let's say, some broader groupings, kingdoms or peoples, depending on how they were called. We've seen some of the most important before, like the Midianites, the Amalekites, the Alamu. These were counted as tribes, technically, but some of their force would extend at some point also over other tribes, and so making some sort of overlordship, so something more organized. And of course, the entire interaction between these tribes was in turn based on tributes, this sort of clienteling recognition. The same happened abroad, internationally. And through this mechanism, much of the aforementioned mercenarism occurred, because it happened that clans would send some of their forces to be, say, raised somewhere else under the guidance of a particular leader that was reputed for like military prowess. And as we've seen also, for example, with the clashes with Israel and the Assyrians, this constant skirmishing, harassing was exactly the testing ground of these war bands, of this youth that eventually had to make it out there, where or another, like either win or die. And so at that point, because of his reliability as a leader, like gathering forces under his command and going around and hopefully more or less settling in some more favorable location, and maybe founding something more stable, like at least relatively stable for Arab standards. When raiding, mobility and speed would require all Arab warriors to be mounted. This is where the camels come into place, because of course, here we're not even talking. There were also horsemen, of course, but the camel was much more suited for this, say, desertic environment on long-range offensives. In fact, this was also the point that you could cross like a lot of wasteland that the Senatries attacked would have sort of not chased the Arabs into, because it was probably nothing. And with camel, you can't do that. With horse, the horse needs more, say, can store less resources, less nourishment. The camel doesn't hold water; he actually holds fat, right? And so, the oases are that important, but it's also like as far as food, what really matters. The camel is also like pretty large beast, and so it has these specific advantages. Plus, horses, as you know, are rendered nervous by these Camelidae, and they don't like their smell. They are disturbed by them. Plus, the camels allow you to carry stuff on them, including captives, plunder, which, as we've seen, were the main objective, like, of these. Also, for how the standard tactics consisting of hit and run raids were properly enacted, which was yet another advantage. Of course, Arab warriors could and would dismount if required, also because fighting on camels, as you understand here, it's not that easy, actually. In any case, the sense was that you could get the hell out of the way on the camel, and so hitting, running away, and sort of not being caught. And in that context, also the bow was very useful. We are in the Bronze Age. Chariot warfare, as you know, is also about missile warfare, not just the shock charge. That, however, is actually the underrated aspect of it all. Like, as I explained also in other videos about chariot warfare, there is a big deal of emphasis on the idea that, oh, look at how many arrows that essentially the chariot caracal during the Bronze Age warfare poured on the enemy. But the thing that made it all was the final smashing charge of the chariots, and we shouldn't overly estimate that. And the fact that, of course, that the camel is not, say, camel does have that, can be used like in attack for smashing capacities, but it's also not so well suited, like not much to the chariot, but just like cavalry itself brings. Also, for, as we've seen, the general incapability of the Arabs to field actual chariotry, the main armament being the bow, because how do you strike the enemy? Like on camel, it's very complicated. Even just the type of spear grip must be like, it's more like fighting from an elephant. All right, the elephant at least smashes much harder. The point of the camel is that it's tall, it runs fast, and you can't get the hell out of the way. And shooting at the enemy, in fact, we don't see particularly heavily armored and armed Arab warriors in the first place. Again, in general, typically these troops were light, right? The elite was heavier. There is no doubt you could have seen like an armored Arab warrior at this point on a camel. Quite a sight, sort of partial. They not necessarily wasted trooper there, but say Arabs would keep fighting also especially among each other as infantry. This is something you can see easily in spite of the further development of cavalry, etc., until like the migration era. The early Islamic armies, Arab or Islamic armies were really mostly about infantry. I made a very old video about that. We'll come back probably talking about such context soon. But in this raid, again, also the camel riders' armament had to be light. And so, yes, you kind of bet on that. Speed, right? You raid, you have the means to move fast and with an important autonomy, loading, plundering captives, and essentially running away, and even shooting at the enemy if they are chasing you, all right? And then, of course, any other, say, military logic in terms of unit, of formation, of individual and collective combat applies a bit like the same for other mounts, right? Even though, of course, like each one has its own technicality and therefore does not quite respond in the same way. There would be probably for this reason more to look at least in the type of operations that are recorded, and that's what we are looking at now. Because we have some evidence from Assyrian sources regarding the mobility and increased range and surprise conferred by the camels to the Arab attacks, right? And the Assyrians seem to have found, of course, an effective answer as a very advanced military to these nomads, right? The first one would have been using them as well, like your troops. And we will see now one anecdote, one situation in which Ashurbanipal found himself in his first Arabian campaign. I will digress a little just to talk about Ashurbanipal's Arabian campaigns because they are really interesting. To make the very long story short, Ashurbanipal's campaigns against tribes in the Levant were primarily motivated by, as we've seen, the usual tribal raids and disruptions to trade that challenged Assyrian interests. The first campaign against the Kedarites, is yet another important group, is notable for Yauta, the king who revolted and led plundering against the Assyrian Empire. And this war culminated in the defeat of the rebels with the assistance of Moab's forces, resulting in Yauta's escape, while Amuladin was captured. In subsequent narratives, the complexity of leadership in rebellion is emphasized, and you understand this was also pretty much like a civil war, like within these Arab groups, particularly also with Yauta's connections to earlier revolts. It was always the same way, like the Assyrians would try to co-opt certain elements that would be overthrown, and then so they had to come back there to reassert dominance in order. And this was very complicated to do because, as we've seen, the various centers were very scattered and sort of poor, and so the entire system was very, very unstable. Plus, there were always these peoples from the hinterland that were even more savage and always fueled like the war bands that would carry out this destabilization process that was brought like on the even beyond the doorsteps of the Assyrian Empire. Now, during the Assyrian Civil War involving Shamash Shumukin, some Arab leaders, including those previously supported by Ashurbanipal, turned against him. This is typical. Further, so because of course of again big mess as we were saying in the beginning in the Assyrian Empire, fuck any fealty, like you just attack, just grab, right? Because this is what these people really do. Like they're striving to remain in power, and they have this riches at hand because like the Assyrians are too busy like killing each other. You want to grab them, you want to seize them, and then what? Like it's always a gamble, it's always a risk. You may die being killed in this Assyrian counter-strike, or you can be killed by like the next guy who, if you are too weak doing nothing, especially in this circumstance, will want to take you out, and he will, because he has all these hungry warriors want to actually launch the raids. So that's how volatile let's say the entire political system is, right? And naturally this this Arabian revolts further strained Assyrian control, especially on the frontier. A major counteroffensive was organized to respond to renewed raids by these tribes. The Assyrian army's campaigns faced formidable challenges, navigating this hostile terrain while pursuing Arabian forces into the desert. The eventual victories led to the capture of key figures like Abiate and Ruait, with the latter being humiliated, and Alamu met with a gruesome fate. The Assyrians were not particularly sensitive towards like human mercy or this other kind of useless things. And of course, these people had challenged a divine order in the first place. And although Ashurbanipal's campaigns against the Arabs were conducted with notable determination, resulting, by the way, in extensive spoils, of course, Arabs were enslaved, sold, brought, deported, and they have also been viewed as strategic missteps to some degree. The conflicts damaged significant resources and resulted in inflation, in famine, because even this loot, like these deportees, had to be showed for the purpose of saying we won, but then what have you actually done? Have you conquered like another place? You have spent all these regional resources for literal sand that you don't control anyway. Things will return to that anyway. So without achieving lasting consolidation of Assyrian authority over the contested regions, and highlighting, of course, the complexities and consequences of such military engagement at this time. The interesting anecdote regarding Ashurbanipal's first Arab campaign is regarding like the way that the Assyrians would cope with Arab tactics. That is to say, stationing Assyrian troops at the Arab wells, right, as we've seen in the Oasis, and attacking with mobile forces of combined chariotry and cavalry. This is extremely interesting. As you know, the Assyrian military was very advanced. They're basically the first true army in history to have like some solid, say, infantries of, say, aligned according to some important standard. If you look at the Hittites connection, also with the Argos panoply, there is even some, at this point, like development of proto-hoplitic warfare. I made multiple videos about this topic. And so they would have actually pretty tough infantry. That is how they mostly fought anyway in Mesopotamia. That was not all like open grounds and pitched battles, as we've seen in the videos about Assyrian tactics. Assyrians used a lot of archers, a lot of skirmishers of this other barbarian auxiliaries that were habituated to fight on tough terrain, and the Arabs would have actually accounted for this particular type of environment in usefulness. So you would have like the best. This makes a lot of sense strategically. The best troops, like the infantrymen that could not simply run away, or they needed all a specific logistical train, etc., but they could bulkily rely on themselves. Stationed at the wells, at the oases, because there they had more or less what they needed. They had local resources, water primarily in the desert, and then other, say, also agricultural resources, and the possibility of maintaining themselves on the longer run. As we've seen, the Arabs need to let their camels drink, and they need this oasis. So they're basically attracted to these places where, however, tough Assyrian infantry is there, and these guys, of course, know how to resist camel charges. And that's actually the point. If they were passing by, as we've seen, they would also poison the wells so that those poor camels could not drink, and also the people, for that matter. But the camels are more, sympathetic in this case. And in the meanwhile, the mobile forces, so maybe other Bedouins, right? But here, that's the interesting thing, the combination of chariotry and cavalry at this point in history, allowing to chase the cameled troops. And this really makes a lot of sense tactically, because this charioteer, this chariots and cavalry will also help the heavier troops at the wells and the oases to not to be cut off, right, from the supply lines. So it would be actually pretty intense hit and run, tactics from both sides, raidings, skirmishes, because that's basically what these peoples were about. And so, especially when the access to the oasis, the normal Arab watering places, was denied, there wasn't really much that they could do, like even in terms of mobilization of larger forces that could cope with the Assyrians, because of course, like, there were other, sources of water deeper, like in the hinterland, but there weren't enough, like, to sustain towards the fringe, like larger forces, when these lacked in the fringe that kind of like water could not really be transported, etc. So the only option at that point strategically was either like risking everything. This was always stretched at the limits of, like, balance odds, but of course, once the enemy has the upper hand, it's this greater military power in general. Without the oasis, you can't really move first, like at least your movements would be curtailed, and especially your numbers will begin to dwindle, because as we've seen, these chieftains were tasked with, that's what they were all about, like finding the strategical solution to this, and breaking through, sometimes very savagely, very aggressively, straightforward. And either, again, breaking or losing. And in this sense, remaining, when succeeding, of course, like, mission accomplished, go on. But most of the other cases, like, the troops would have said, what are we even doing here? Like, we are thirsty, we can't break through, we'll go back home. And this is what all this system worked like, right? And we were saying it before. I mean, the Assyrians here were the bigger power around. They would scare off, like, because of their superiority, these peoples from the desert that, as we've seen, were not particularly developed from a military point of view. They didn't have much of a solid military organization. Their tactics were what they were, and at the end of the day, they weren't searching for much else than this kind of continuous raiding that could escalate and sometimes do something better, but fundamentally being just connaturated to the political and social context that they expressed. So, looking at these cameled troops, we are, of course, very appreciative, especially towards the Assyrians, for having showed us what these guys looked like, right, in some decently detailed art that really exemplifies the interesting, I would say, looking at these pictures, you see the horses chasing the camels, like the single guys mostly actually riding the camel, like being there. Also a lot of actual think about how to ride a camel, right? All a level of athleticism and physicality that had to derive from intense practice, intense experience, right? And so the camel itself was seen as some sort of might of nature to be tamed, as I've seen with evidently military, it's a religious significance attached, and pretty much connected with the this shows you what kind of paths military history can take, right? In the most sort of absurd ones, apparently fighting over a camel. It sounds like a weird idea, but it still work because under pressure you will find the thing that will actually work best, and most of it will just remain that, right? And that's pretty much it, right? So we will keep talking more about Arab warfare. There's really a lot about it throughout the eras overall, and so I don't know how many videos I made, if there is actually an Arab playlist of some sort. I guess so, but I think I haven't. Maybe there ain't. Maybe there ain't actually, because I haven't made enough videos on it. That's one I have to create anyway, because it's always, again, interesting and important to even just give this like sense of, say, thematic content. I mean, a lot of stuff apparently much about Arab warfare, it is true. Like, I made the video about the Arab warrior or the Achaemenid army that, as we've seen, is pretty much what we have already seen in this video, because they would do pretty similar things. And yes, there isn't much about ancient Arab warfare, right? There will be something about the medieval part. Will start enriching a bit, like the broader picture, but definitely ain't much. And again, we'll make up for it. It should make maybe some Semitic warfare playlist or something like. But maybe I'm even creating too many of them. Check out my playlist, because that's actually the best place where you can find interesting content for your inclinations. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.